We are going to start out tonight's episode. Welcome to Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you from Ra'anana outside Tel Aviv. I am here for the entire summer, which is really nice to feel like an Israeli for the first time in a long time. I've been on these tours that lasted 3, 4 months at a time. So to finally be here for 4.5 months straight without any trips, it's nice. Now, I must say, this is a hard time to be here. Of all the times to pick to live in Israel for 4 or 5 months straight. Like this is a difficult one, and we'll get into that more tonight. But nevertheless, it is good to feel grounded and home here in Israel, which is where I'm coming to you from right now. It is June 30th, 2024, and June 30th, as you may or may not know, is a very significant date on the Israeli calendar. I guarantee you, every elementary school child knows what June 30th is. And you could probably guess just by the way I framed that. June 30th is the official end of school for elementary school kids here in Israel. And that's one unique aspect of Israeli life is there is a national school calendar. Calendar always begins, the school calendar always starts on September 1st, or if September 1st is a Shabbat, then it's September 2nd, the Sunday, and it always ends on June 30th. So kids here in Israel have those dates emblazoned in their minds. Obviously, June 30th is the better of the two. September 1st, not as good if you're a little kid, because that means you're going back to school. But today, school let out. And I just contrast that with being a kid at Solomon Schechter back in Skokie, Illinois, when I was growing up, where we would have to check the calendar every year to see when the last day of school was. Sometimes it was on the 20th of June. Others times it would be on the 15th, which is my half birthday. So I would always note that. But here in Israel, you have one national school calendar. And what that also means is that this is the age of the Tkasim, which is Hebrew for the ceremonies. One thing I can say about Israelis is, man, they love their ceremonies. I mean, no milestone, no matter how tiny it is, goes by without some sort of ceremony to mark it. And school is no different. And, every school age has its own version of the ceremony. And as I was walking through Ra'anana this week, I saw all the various ceremonies going on sometimes at the schools. I live across from an elementary school, and God help my family. We've been hearing them rehearse for their ceremony for the past probably month. These ceremonies are taken very seriously by the schools. The songs that they've been singing are like burned into my brain at this point, but they finally had their ceremony on Thursday night. And then even at young ages, nursery school, going to kindergarten, kindergarten moving to first grade, they have their ceremonies as well. And they're really different by every age. So for the nursery schoolers, these would often happen in Park Ra'anana, where I would go for my walk or a run at some points. And it was always very cute. A lot of chairs set up for the parents. And then the kids would walk through like a cardboard cutout of a gate or a picture of a bridge or some sort of portal that they would walk through as they were officially ushered from the end of nursery school into the big time next year of kindergarten. And often the kids had no idea really what was going on. They were just told to stand up from their chair when their name was called and to walk through the cardboard. Super, super cute. And of course, all the parents around videoing and taking pictures, and the kids would take a picture with the teacher, who I must say, they're all so loving, these teachers, and so huggy and lovey-dovey with the children and with the parents as well. It's very congenial and family-like, and very, very sweet. The next really big ceremony for school kids would be at the end of sixth grade, moving to seventh grade. So here in Israel, middle school is seventh, eighth, and ninth grades. It's 3 years beginning in seventh. So at the end of sixth grade, that's a really big deal when kids finish sixth and they're now going on to seventh grade. And these kind of ceremonies, they often have choreographed dances and some songs. Maybe a couple kids will read a poem or something like that. But they're a little more choreographed than obviously the nursery school, the kindergarten ceremonies, but still a lot of fun to watch and very cute. And then the next really big ceremony is high school. Oh, well, I guess the end of middle school, there's a ceremony going into high school. So at the end of ninth grade, there's another tekes, another ceremony for kids going up to high school. And high school here in Israel is only 3 years, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. Personally, I actually like that quite a bit. I have a kid who just finished eighth grade. He seems too young to me to be going to high school. I have friends back in the US who have kids his age, and they're going to high school next year, and they're going to be with 18-year-olds. It just seems a little weird to put 14-year-olds and 18-year-olds in the same building. It's actually more logical to me to put 11th, 12th, 10th, 11th, and 12th together. They seem a little more in the same universe and able to get along better. So I'm happy with that we only have 3 years of high school here, and that middle school is longer. And then, of course, the other really big ceremony is the end of high school. I've had two kids graduate from high school here so far, and they had their graduation ceremonies. They are nothing like the graduation ceremonies in the US. First of all, no speeches, no valedictorian. Uh, it's really much more like the last night of summer camp where the kids all get up on stage and sing a parody of pop songs, except instead of the real lyrics, they put in the names of teachers and funny incidents from the schools. Um, it was so lovingly sloppy. Like that's what I remember about my kids' graduations here in Israel is that it really did have that end of summer camp feel with, cheesy choreography and a lot of missed lines and messing up, but so much more authentic. I mean, that's what it should be at the age of 18. And all the more so because these kids, it's a very important graduation ceremony here in Israel. It's not off to college for them, it's off to the army. So this is really, in a way, the end of childhood. The high school graduation ceremony when they're all up on stage, and this happened for us in Park Ra'anana in the big amphitheater, when they're all up on stage singing together, and there's the school band is in the background playing. It was bittersweet because you know that in a matter of weeks, most of these kids are going to be at the Bakum, the Basis Klita Umiyun, which is the induction center to begin the process of being inducted into the Israeli army. And that's really what I want to touch on tonight is what it means to raise a child here. Walking around and seeing these ceremonies in Ra'anana, I couldn't help but think about the fact that every one of these kids, not just the high schoolers, but even the nursery schoolers, maybe even them especially, I was looking at as they walked through their little cardboard cutouts. I was thinking, man, these little kids are going to be in the army one day, assuming that Israel still needs an army, you know, 15 years from now. Hey, maybe it won't. Maybe things will be so different that mandatory service is no longer necessary. I don't really see that happening. I'm not counting on it. And I just couldn't help but think of the fact that these little children all will be going. Um, and what drove it home even more is that Saturday night, which is last night at 8:45 p.m., as soon as Shabbat ended, we got a text message like everyone else in Ra'anana who signed up on the Ra'anana WhatsApp group. The city hall put together a WhatsApp group for the entire city to notify us about, sewer repairs and any other issues you need to know about living in Ra'anana. It's a great way to stay in touch. But last night at 8:45, as soon as Shabbat ended, everyone on the WhatsApp group for Ra'anana got a text message that in an hour and a half at 10:15 p.m. would be the funeral for a soldier who was killed from Ra'anana just the day before. His name is Yair Avitan. He was only 20 years old. Um, and again, a Ra'anana resident. You know, some soldiers, they sort of like touch you more when you hear about them having fallen. He went to a middle school called Meitarim, which is where three of my kids went to middle school. So, I can picture the lunchroom where he ate his lunches. I can picture the locker area where he put his book bags every day in the classrooms, in the school office. I know where this kid was going every day to school because my kids went there as well. And he, if he grew up in Ra'anana, which I know he did, that means he went to nursery school too, and his parents watched him walk through one of those cheesy cardboard cutouts as he moved from nursery school to kindergarten and all the other ceremonies I mentioned to you. Uh, and it's just, it made me think about what it means to raise a kid here. I don't know if the right word is the burden or the cost or simply the phenomenon of raising a child in Israel, but it is so different from raising a kid really anywhere else, but certainly with the place that I can most easily compare it to, which is the United States, which is where, I grew up and I went to high school and graduated, and it was all about the colleges and the college tests and the pressure to get into a good school. And if it was bad back then, 28 years ago for me, then it's even worse. Now we all know the pressure the kids are under in the US, but how that's taken over. And it's just so different here. That the focus here when kids get to the end of high school is where they're going to the army, and it's a stage of life. For most kids, they don't even give it a second thought. When I was in the army myself, so many times the soldiers in my platoon would ask me, "Why didn't you just serve in the American army if you're American?" And I explained to them, "Well, as a Jew, Israel is my country, and the Israeli army is not just the army of Israel; it's the army of the Jewish people." And I would then flip the question and say, "Well, why are you serving in the army? What does it mean to you?" And so many of them said the same thing. It's what we do after high school. For them, it was simply the next step, and they'd never really deeply questioned it before. Um, but it really brings to mind seeing all these graduation ceremonies this past week, and also hearing about the death of Yair Avitan, just what it means to raise a kid here and how incredibly different it is and how it affects parenting too. You'll often hear the stereotype that Israeli kids are undisciplined and wild, and they are. I mean, trust me, I live in a country full of Israeli kids, and they definitely are wilder than kids that you'll meet in America, or Europe. But part of the reason is the army. I think a lot of parents, the attitude here is that the army will give them all the discipline they need eventually. So I don't have to worry about disciplining them as much. I think most parents also want to give their kids a sweet childhood because in the back of their mind somewhere is the knowledge that their kids will be in the army at some point. And so maybe they're not as harsh or as disciplinarian as parents in other places for that reason. But also you don't have the pressure of college. A lot of parents I know in the US are very concerned from an early age. I remember going to tours of Jewish day schools when I was looking at kindergartens, and the principal of the school would talk about how graduates from this day school went on to Harvard, Princeton, Yale. And this is for a tour of kindergarten. That kind of pressure does not exist here. So that's another reason that the childhood is different. But I think the army plays a big part of it. And knowing your kid is going to go when they're 18, it changes how you raise your kid from the beginning. But that was on my mind a lot this week. As I walked around town and saw these really beautiful, sweet ceremonies, and also since last night, thinking about the death of Yair Avitan, Zichrono Livracha. So we're going to take our first break right now, and then I'll be back in a moment with some of the biggest news stories coming out of Israel this week. Well, this is one of those weeks where it's really hard to choose what are the three stories that are most worth focusing on. There are domestic stories, there are international stories, there's even stuff happening in the US, that could affect what happens in Israel over the next 5 months, 6 months, next 10 years. But I chose three stories that I thought would give you the most insight into what Israelis are talking about now and what's really on our minds. And the place where I absolutely think we have to start is with the Attorney General of Israel pretty much stating that the government must start drafting ultra-Orthodox soldiers into the IDF. As I've talked about so many times on this podcast before, this is one of the major issues in Israel right now, is the drafting of the ultra-Orthodox. For the past 76 years, they've gotten away with not serving. It has a lot to do with Israel's coalition government, that at the end of the day, you cannot be in charge. You cannot run the government unless you have a coalition. And to make those coalitions, you always end up needing these very small, ultra-religious Jewish parties. And that makes them the kingpins. They're the deal makers. They can say, we will only join your coalition if you continue to subsidize our yeshivas, and if you allow us exemptions from the IDF. And so it's gone on this way for 76 years. And to be fair, I have blamed the right-wing government a lot, and Netanyahu, I'm not the biggest fan of him, but to be completely fair, this is every government in the history of Israel who's done this. Yair Lapid, when he was the short-lived prime minister, he was giving these kind of benefits to the ultra-Orthodox as well, simply because that was the only way he could stay in power. And frankly, I don't think Israel has ever faced an existential threat the way it might now, where we actually needed those ultra-Orthodox soldiers. But with everything happening, with the war in Gaza and possibly this war in Lebanon coming up, and also the number of deaths. We're at, I think, 319 deaths of Israeli soldiers. Several thousand IDF soldiers have already been designated as permanently injured from the war in Gaza. There's just this sense in Israel that it is not fair. It is not fair that one segment of society is bearing the burden, the cost of military service and everything that goes along with it, while this whole other population is not only not serving, but receiving monetary subsidies for every child they have and for studies in yeshivas. As I've mentioned before, 50% of ultra-Orthodox men do not contribute to the labor pool here in Israel. And everything post-October 7th has really brought this to the forefront. Now, I want to give you some context on this idea of drafting the ultra-Orthodox. It's very interesting. In many polls, just about every poll I've read on this here, the drafting of the ultra-Orthodox into the army is the one issue that all Israelis, except for them, can agree on. It's sort of a uniting issue. What do I mean by that? Well, if you were to ask people what's more important, winning the war or bringing home the hostages, you'll get a range of opinions here in Israel. And typically those more on the right will favor wiping out Hamas and finishing the war. Those more on the left will favor bringing home the hostages at any cost. If you poll people who should be the next prime minister, the most recent poll, most people favor Naftali Bennett, who would have to make a comeback and return to politics in order for that to happen, but he's hinting that he would. Others say Benny Gantz. Some still say Netanyahu, but there's disagreement. If you ask Israelis, should we begin an investigation into October 7th now, or should we wait till after the war? You'll get a split. Again, most on the right say wait till after the war. Most on the left say now. However, there is one issue that when you ask Israelis, pretty much everyone answers the same way, which is, should we draft the ultra-Orthodox into the IDF? And it doesn't matter if you're right-wing or left or religious or secular or what party, Likud, Labor, whatever that you normally subscribe to, this issue unites Israeli society, except for the ultra-Orthodox themselves. So what is going to happen? Well, I've talked about this before too on Inside Israel, that I expect to see Jew-on-Jew violence happen at some point. And we're already seeing it. We saw it tonight. There was a large protest. The number I heard was 10,000. I'm not sure what the exact number was, but I heard 10,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews protesting in Mea She'arim. Mea She'arim is the very ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem. Probably a lot of you have taken a tour of Mea She'arim at some point. But they were protesting the idea that they would be drafted into the army. But then they left Mea She'arim and started walking out into regular downtown Jerusalem and other parts of Jerusalem. And you're talking about thousands of ultra-Orthodox doing this. And so the police had to use water cannons, but not just water cannons. There's a new water cannon being used in Israel right now. It's it's called skunk water cannons. It's water, but it's got the scent of a skunk, a very heavy odor, really to not just push people away, but to discourage them from even getting close to it. And police had to use these skunk-laced, scent water cannons on the ultra-Orthodox who were protesting. And the ultra-Orthodox were getting violent. They were getting violent with the police. And I've said this before, this is the type of Jew-on-Jew violence that I think we should expect in the future, because this is going to be a hugely divisive issue. They absolutely do not want to go. They do not see it as their obligation. They feel serving in the army would interfere with their ability to be completely Shomer Shabbat and kosher, and also stop them from studying Torah. Also, I think we can say what we want. I can say what I want, but I think they truly believe, or many of them do, that studying Torah is as important, if not more important, probably more important to the safety and security of Israel than military service or taking up arms. So that is a factor as well. This is not simply, there are kids all over Israel, but sort of the stereotype is North Tel Aviv. You know that there are kids in North Tel Aviv who don't want to serve in the army and find a way to get out of it. This is not that. These are people who absolutely do not feel that they should be, and feel it's an intrusion on their rights to have to serve in the IDF. And I don't see these protests going away. I see them getting even more violent. And the other area where I can see this kind of Jew-on-Jew violence really happening is if Israel ever decided to pull settlers out of the West Bank. I would expect to see that kind of Jew-on-Jew violence as well. But this is a huge story in Israel right now, and we don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. We need the soldiers. Right now, what the number I'm hearing is that we need 11,000 soldiers in order to make up for the gap. The gap meaning those soldiers who've just been serving too long in Gaza and don't have the mental, the physical energy to go and fight a war in Lebanon. The reserves, especially. The cases of PTSD I mentioned, the number of soldiers who are suffering from PTSD is climbing, and we're not able to send them back into combat. So this isn't a luxury. We need these extra soldiers. And as I mentioned, last year alone, 2023, 66,000 ultra-Orthodox soldiers received exemptions from serving in the IDF. And meanwhile, the Knesset is raising the age limits for miluim, reserve duty, for those who are serving. They're adding an extra year to the reserve duty, and men who drafted 18 have already had their service extended from 2 years, 8 months to a full 3 years, so by another 4 months. So you really see how unfair that this is, that those of us in the society who are serving are having our service extended while the rest are getting the exemptions. And a lot of, the big difference is a lot of Likud lawmakers are recognizing that this is an issue that they can't just go along with the party anymore. Their own career will be in danger if they keep supporting exemptions for the ultra-Orthodox and extending the service of those who are currently serving. This is like I said, even Likud voters said that this is an important issue to them. And so something's going to change. I don't know how it's going to happen when you have a group who is this adamant about not serving, but this is definitely one of the big news stories of the week. And as we're talking right now, some of this violence might be going on in Jerusalem. These protests might still be happening. The second big story I want to bring into the broadcast is the war in the north. Um, I've said so many times, the war is coming, the war is coming, the boy who cried war. I'm confused. A lot of Israelis are really, really confused right now. We're hearing mixed messages from our own leaders. We're hearing mixed messages from Hezbollah. Everyone is basically saying the same thing. We will obliterate the other side if war happens. We're saying we will return Lebanon to the Stone Age. Hezbollah is saying we will wipe Israel off the map. And yet both sides also say, and yet we are not seeking a war at this time. One analysis that I have heard is that Hezbollah is stuck, that on October 7th, or really October 8th, they started bombing Israel as a way to show solidarity with Hamas. But now they're kind of stuck and they don't know how to get out of it. So they're going to keep bombing a little bit and keep themselves into the game until they find what's called an off-ramp, some sort of way that they can pull out and stop attacking Israel. That what they really want is to stop attacking Israel, but saving face is so important in the Middle East in general and in Arab culture specifically that if they were to simply stop bombing Israel now, it would be a huge insult to themselves and the leaders would look bad to their own people. So for now, it is sort of this game of tit for tat and a very heavy one. I mean, there are consequences on both sides. I think more serious consequences for Hezbollah, given the number of their leadership who's been taken out. But we are losing soldiers, we are losing civilians. Our forests have been on fire, homes have been ruined. The north is evacuated. We used to have a security zone in Lebanon. Now our security zone against Hezbollah is in Israel. Our residents still are not able to return to the north. This has to end. I will say most people I speak to would prefer that there not be a war, because what we've heard is that this war would be very scary for the entire country. We're talking about living in our bomb shelters for a week, 2 weeks, possibly more, with bottled water and corn and canned tuna and not even allowed outside. This is not some missiles that are randomly fired up into the air and waiting to see where they land, which is what Hamas typically does. But these are guided missiles capable of hitting anywhere in the country. That's what Hezbollah has, thanks to Iran. And so this kind of war would be very bad for all of Israel in terms of the destruction, the disruption to life, um, the damage to Israeli infrastructure, including possible military targets, civilian targets, universities, educational institutions, anything that matters that Hezbollah would try to hit. The one group that really does want a war are residents of the North. I mean, residents of the North do not want some sort of agreement on paper, because what they're saying is, look what happens when you have an agreement on paper with, for example, Hamas. They use the time to rebuild, to rearm themselves, and then they attack. And the residents of the North who are displaced right now are saying, we do not want to go back to our homes until there is a war. I think I just swallowed a fly. Until there is a war with Hezbollah. So the residents of the North actually do want this conflict simply because they don't feel comfortable living there unless we have some sort of war that can actually take Hezbollah out and handicap it and prevent it from attacking the North the way it is right now. I will say, I had an interesting conversation this past week. One of my good friends, his name is Yoav. He's an officer in Mishmar HaGvul, which is the border control. And he was doing miluim since reserve duties from October 8th till about a month ago. So really, 5, 6 months he was doing reserve duty service up in the north. And he told me, he had a lot of interaction with residents of the north who were living in hotels and youth hostels just below the area where residents are no longer allowed. And he said that these residents, they would say things like, "We don't mind living here in this hotel, in as long as we wipe Hezbollah out." One man told him, "I can live with doing my own laundry in the sink for a few more months if it means we get rid of Hezbollah." He was describing the conditions to me that, parents are living in hotel rooms with their children for months and months at a time. You've probably all taken a family vacation at some point with your kids. I know I have. That first night in the hotel together is really a lot of fun. By night 3, 4, 5, it's cabin fever. You're all on top of each other. It's tough. So think about doing that for months at a time, living in a hotel room with your kids. That's what residents of the North are going through. And it made me kind of realize that one reason this is even able to happen at all is that because residents of the North tend to be, certainly of these big towns of like Kiryat Shmona, they tend to be of a lower socioeconomic level. If this were Tel Aviv, where people had to be evacuated for months at a time, I don't think I don't think the country could react the same way. It's similar to, how with Hurricane Katrina, residents of the U.S. were able to be treated one way, but if we had ever had a disaster like that in Manhattan, it would be thought of differently because of the different populations. I think it's similar in Israel, that one reason residents are able to be displaced for so long is they're not Tel Avivians. When you're outside of Tel Aviv, sort of a different standard applies, which is sad to say. But that's also why the South was able to be bombed for years and years. Sderot, these kibbutzim in the South, the news here in Israel would always be big news if Hamas had a rocket that actually came toward Tel Aviv. Then everyone panicked. Then everyone took it seriously. But as long as they were falling on Sderot and these other towns in the South, it was seen as sort of like the cost of doing business. It's what happens when you live in the South. And people didn't fret about it so much. Now, obviously, that's changed since October 7th. But that's a big part of the story, too, is who's suffering here and who's displaced and who isn't. And how would we feel if we were the ones who were displaced? I know it's really easy for me to sit in, my fifth floor apartment here in Ra'anana telling you that I don't want a war because of how it would disrupt my life. But the fact is, I'm not under threat from Hezbollah the way the residents of Kiryat Shmona and Metula and these other northern areas are. We do need to see it through their eyes as well. The final story of the night is the one that gave us the title of this program. And I don't think I announced the title of the program. Those of you on the newsletter, which is probably a lot of you, you know that the title of tonight's episode is Doctors with Truly No Borders. And that title comes from a finding by Israel of, that there's a doctor in Gaza named Fadi Al-Wadiya. And Dr. Fadi Al-Wadiya is a member of Doctors Without Borders, or how is it called in French? Médecins Sans Frontières, right? So this wonderful organization, which honestly I used to support, and I used to give money to Doctors Without Borders because it really is a lovely idea that doctors would go on their own voluntarily to countries around the world where medical care isn't accessible specifically to children and give of their services to these populations which otherwise wouldn't receive medical care. However, Israel discovered that one of the Doctors Without Borders in Gaza is also an Islamic Jihad rocket maker. That's right, Fadi Al-Wadiya, in addition to being a physician, is an expert rocket maker and a chemist who would help develop other weapons for Islamic Jihad. Now, of course, this was immediately denied by Doctors Without Borders, which so often happens when Israel presents evidence, when Israel says that, hey, this hospital in Gaza actually was not bombed by Israel. It was bombed by an errant rocket launched by Islamic Jihad. It's always denied immediately. But then Israel provided proof. Israel provided a number of photographs, which you can go ahead and see online, of Dr. Fadi Al-Wadiya in his military fatigues in Islamic Jihad meetings and planning rooms. So why am I sharing this story? It's not just because of the shock that someone who took the Hippocratic Oath would now be turning his skills and talents toward making missiles to kill Jews. although that's part of it. The real reason I'm sharing this story is because I want to give you insight into a concept I've brought up many times before, which is the Israeli take on the notion of innocent Gazans. You know, the rest of the world has talked a lot about how many innocent civilians in Gaza have been killed. Yes, there are those Hamas militants who've been killed, but then there are the innocent civilians who've been killed. And I've told you on Inside Israel before that we in Israel simply do not see it that way. We do not think of Gazans as innocent civilians the way the rest of the world does. Now, it's not that we're heartless. It's not that we want to see children die. We don't. We don't want to see innocent people die. But what we are not able to do is easily dismiss so much of the Gazan population as simply innocent civilians. And we have evidence for this. We know, and I've shared some of this before, but I'll repeat it. It's worth repeating. We know that hostages were kidnapped on October 7th by quote unquote innocent civilians, not members of Hamas, not members of Islamic Jihad, but civilians who came in through the open fence into Israel and looted property, stole from the kibbutzim that they rampaged, and kidnapped and took part in the murder of Israelis on October 7th. Ordinary Gazans, not members of Hamas or Islamic Jihad. So there's a case of civilians who are clearly not so innocent. We know that when our hostages were taken into Gaza, they were often dragged through the streets and they were kicked and beaten by Gazan civilians. This includes Israeli children who were taken hostage and who were beaten and kicked and spat upon by Gazan civilians. So again, this whole idea of innocent Gazans who are just happen to be caught up in some conflict against their will. Yeah, I'm sure there are some like that, but there are many who are part of it as well. There's a whole idea of where these hostages are being held. You know, when we had the rescue operation just about 3 weeks ago now, was it 4 weeks ago, of the four hostages, they were being held by families. And we know that in many cases, hostages have been held by families. And we've had firsthand accounts of how sometimes the children in these families would come to the hostages and offer them food. And then when the hostages would hold out their hand to take the food, the children would yank it back and not give them the food, taunting them. I mean, the kids are part of it too. So do we Israelis like to see children die in Gaza? No, we absolutely do not. And I can tell you that what's happening in Gaza it's horrible. It is a humanitarian crisis. But we in Israel are not losing sleep over that because the whole idea of innocent Gazans just doesn't resonate with us the way it does with the rest of the world. Frankly, I'm a little surprised the rest of the world doesn't see it the way we do. The evidence is out there. These are not secret ideas I'm sharing with you. But then again, the question becomes, what do you want to believe? What narrative are you most comfortable sticking with? I think a lot of people would rather believe in the paradigm they already believe in. But I think the story is important because it shows you just how intertwined the civilians and our enemy in Gaza are. And it demonstrates also why we in Israel are so much less willing to shed tears over the collateral damage that's happening. We're not glad it's happening, but for us, it's what we need to do to dismantle Hamas and to bring our hostages home. We're going to take a quick break, and then I'll be back in a moment to answer your questions. All right, we are back, and we have some great questions this week. Our first one comes from Matt. So Matt writes, Joel, in your newsletter last week, you talked about how your 16-year-old daughter went to the IDF induction center to begin the process of joining the Israeli army. My question is, did you make a mistake when you said 16? Isn't it age 18 when Israeli kids are drafted? So, Matt, great question. Yes, at age 18, Israelis officially enter the Israeli army. They go to the Bakum, I mentioned before, Basis Klita Umiyun. They receive their dog tags, uniform, gun, the unit they're assigned to, get on a bus, go off to their base for basic training. But the process begins in their, what we would call here in Israel, 11th grade, in the US, what's called the junior year of high school. That's when it all starts. When you're 16, you get a letter in the mail telling you what date to show up at the draft board, Lishkat Giyus, to begin the process of the interviews, the psychometric tests, the questionnaires, the medical exams, all the things you need to do before you actually get drafted into the army itself. So no, it wasn't a mistake. My 16-year-old at age 16 began her process just last week. It's going to be a long process. It takes about at least a year because there's many rounds of tests and interviews. And the more you do, the more the Army figures out what you're best suited for and what you're not suited for. And then, of course, Israelis often will push back and try to get into the units they want. But it is a long process. It starts when you are 16. By the way, that letter in the mail, that's pretty much the last time there's paper correspondence. In the old day, it was all paper correspondence, but now it's through an app. Kids at the age of 16 download the app, and once they show up for the first time, everything is accessed through that app. Units that are available to them, future dates of interviews, and things they need to report for. But it all starts at the age of 16. Miriam writes in, perhaps you can clarify the situation regarding dual citizenship for Israelis, both living in Israel and abroad. And her specific question is, what are the rules about U.S. citizens who are also Israeli citizens living in Israel voting in U.S. elections? So people like me, I retained my American citizenship, but I also have Israeli citizenship by virtue of my living here. That's true for Dorit, who became an American citizen when we lived in the U.S. It's also true for my 4 kids. And yes, I am entitled to vote in U.S. elections. It is a huge pain in the ass. I won't lie to you. There's a lot of bureaucracy you need to go through in order to vote in a US election. And many people here, many Americans who live in Israel, don't do it for that reason, especially if they live in what's often known as a safe state, a state where you believe that really there's no chance your vote would make a difference. So if you're in Texas, you might think whether you're Democrat or Republican, that votes, at least on the national level, a Republican stronghold. If you're in New York, California, the opposite, those are Democratic. Your vote probably won't make a difference. I try to vote, but it is a hurdle. It is difficult, and you have to go through a lot just to get that ballot. And I don't even remember how I did it last time. But yeah, we are entitled to vote, and I'm curious what's going to happen this year. Will there be a record turnout, given how contentious and close this upcoming November election will be? So Karen writes in, hi, Joel. This isn't a question, but wanted to let you know what occurred in Highland Park, Illinois last night. And just some context for you, I'm from Evanston, Illinois, which is about, I don't know, 6, 7 miles south of Highland Park, really next door. So she said, in case you hadn't heard, at around 2:30 in the morning, a group of 40 masked protesters started chanting the regular vile rhetoric about Jews and Israel in a residential neighborhood of Highland Park. They picked this area because our congressman, Brad Schneider, lives there. He belongs to our synagogue, North Shore Suburban Bethel, which is conservative and where I went to many a bar and bat mitzvah when I was a child, and where I performed last year, as Karen pointed out. Many residents, including me, are very upset that these protesters were allowed to do this for about an hour and no arrests were made. Although they clearly violated a number of ordinances, it is so frustrating that they continue to do this with no repercussions. I feel like if they suffer no consequences here, it's highly doubtful they will suffer them anywhere. And I sadly, Karen, I would just add to that, what happened in New York City at Columbia University, that pretty much all charges were dropped against those. I don't even want to call them protesters, because protesters makes it sound like they're protesting in some sort of acceptable way. I mean, they're a violent anti-Semitic mob, an anti-Israel mob. They were breaking property at Columbia, and all charges were dropped. There were no arrests. This hits home to me, especially, like I said, because I live in Evanston, which is nearby. And also, Evanston was one of the first cities in the US to really try to pass a ceasefire now ordinance against Israel. And it just makes me think, despite, I've said this before too, despite the challenges of living here, whether it's kids going to the army or war or just the expense and the chaos of life in Israel. I personally would not want to be anywhere else. And I wouldn't be surprised if more and more some of you out there are beginning to think of Israel as well. I'd be curious to hear. Don't write me in the chat because that will disappear soon, but email me and maybe I'll share that next time. Thoughts that you guys send in about the possibility of living here. But it's even when it comes to planning a family vacation for this summer, I'm on the fence for a few reasons. One is that, is it right to take a vacation when there are hostages? Is it right to take a vacation when there are soldiers in Gaza and in Lebanon? At the same time, it's been a very stressful past 9 months. And, I want to give my family a little bit of breathing room. But another reason I'm concerned about taking a family vacation is I actually feel safer here than I would anywhere else. Isn't that strange, with a war on two fronts and terrorism in the West Bank? But, we had a flight today. I don't know if you saw this. There's a flight from Warsaw to Tel Aviv that had to make an emergency landing in Turkey because of a passenger who was sick on the plane. So they landed in Turkey. And the El Al pilots requested refueling because it took extra fuel to make this emergency landing. And the Turkish airport authorities refused to refuel this El Al plane. I mean, what world are we living in when you bring a sick passenger to the ground and the airport refuses to refuel your plane simply because you're from Israel? I don't want to be on a plane this summer going somewhere that has to refuel in a country that refuses to, or where they decide they held this plane, by the way. They held this plane on the ground for several hours before finally the plane took off and flew to Greece so it could refuel in Greece so it would have enough fuel before it came home. My point here is that despite how hard it is to be in Israel, I actually feel safer here than I would just about anywhere else. And a story like this about what's happening in Highland Park, it just sort of reiterates how I feel. That even with all the chaos going on right now, I'd rather be here. Is that strange? We're going to take our final quick break, and then I'm going to be back in a moment to close out the podcast with something that I haven't done before. All right, before I close, I'm going to do a small segment called Hebrew is Magic. Now, those of you who are on the regular newsletter, you know that once a week on Thursday, I send out a Hebrew word. And the whole idea is that I break down the word, looking at the shoresh, the root of that word, and I explain what life lessons can you actually learn from this Hebrew word. Hebrew is full of wisdom and clues for how to live, how to be happy, how to be a better parent, a better spouse, how to be a better human being. And I've decided to include some of these words into the podcast as a way to close it out every week. For those of you who aren't on the newsletter, and it's always going to be a different word than was in the newsletter for that week, so you won't get a repeat. And the word I want to focus on tonight is one of my favorite new Hebrew words. I mean, it's new to me, but it's not a new word. But since October 7th, it's been very popular here in Israel. And the word is chiyuni. I had never heard the word chiyuni, but last November I was on a book tour in the US and I called home to Dorit. And as you can imagine, Dorit, Sabra, Israeli, like all of us, was just so devastated after October 7th and really to the point of depression. I mean, there were days she couldn't get out of bed and she was not alone. I mean, so many Israelis were like that. Just their entire dream of what it meant to be Israeli was crushed on that October day. But on this one day in November, when I called home, about a month after, Dorit sounded different for the first time. She had a little pep in her voice. She sounded a little bit happy. Some of her old enthusiasm was back. And I said, Dorit, you sound different. What's new? And she said, well, a friend of mine was able to connect me with an army unit of Givati soldiers who are going into Gaza next week. And so I'm raising money to help buy them some new sleeping bags and some new military equipment. And we're baking for them and we're sending them dinners that we're cooking down to the Gaza border so they can have some nice meals before they go in. And I feel so chiyunit. And I said, wow, what's that word, chiyunit? I've never heard it before. And she explained that chiyunit means to feel needed by another human being, to feel necessary. And I just loved, first of all, that Hebrew has a word for that, to feel needed by another human being. Like, how great is it that Hebrew has a word for that idea? But then I explored the word further to find out what the root is. And it turns out that the shoresh, the root of chiyuni is chai, which means life. And I just feel there's such a beautiful lesson here. You know, all of us are searching for the meaning of life. Why are we here? But Hebrew seems to know that the reason we are here is to be needed by other human beings. And I think that's just a great example of how, when lost, we can turn to Hebrew and Hebrew will point the way. And that's why I do feel that Hebrew is magic. So if you want more of those, they'll of course now be, I think, at the end of every podcast moving forward. But also sign up for the new newsletter, and you can do that at joelchasanoff.com/podcast. I just put that web address in the chat. You can sign up for the newsletter there and get a new Hebrew word every week. And it's also where you can get the links for the live podcast. I also have links to Apple and Spotify podcasts. So if you can't make this live meet, you can listen to the audio recordings there. Please do share Inside Israel with family and friends who you think would enjoy this sort of inside perspective on Israel and Israeli life. Our next broadcast will be next Sunday. That is the 7th of July at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll be sending out the reminders this week in the newsletter and again the day of. If you have questions, go ahead and email them to me, joel@joelchasanoff.com, or through the web address that I just put there in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. As always, I welcome your feedback. I would love to hear what you think about the new format and anything else you'd like to see here. You know where to find me. Lehitraot from Ra'anana. Have a great, peaceful, quiet week. And hey, a happy 4th of July, right? It's just an ordinary day here, but I guess for you it is celebration. Laila Tov, everyone.